what's going to happen is human beings are going to destroy their own world.
No one has actually predicted what the world will look like. Like, no one knows what's coming around the corner. It could be a lot of different things, but we are aware that endings are possible.
I spent almost 14 years reading the Bible with a group of people every Thursday night here in Woodstock. And what we came to ultimately was an understanding that the Bible was like the world's longest literary thought experiment.
I am of the opinion that all of these holy books that we've had, there's wisdom in them, but they're also human constructions. Like, we can look at the historicity of all of these books, even the Buddha's own teachings. There's a history to that.
When I was a Zen Buddhist monk in the 1980s at the monastery, who were up in the middle of the night and roaming around the lake and in the graveyard. I mean, at nighttime, the only illumination in the monastery were candles.
And so you would wander around the graveyard in your Zen Buddhist monastery, and so you're not a vampire. Just, I want to have that on the record.
No, I'm not.
Hello, everyone. This is Scott Carney from Scott Carney Investigates, and I am super excited to talk to Clark Strand because I'm sort of fanboying here because I just read his book, Waking Up to the Dark, about, I'm writing this book on napping and why napping is a good thing and we should all nap. And then I got heavily looking into dreams, and it sent me down this rabbit hole where I was wondering what is up with our sort of hyper lit reality. And I figured I had to get Clark Strand on the phone. He is a former senior editor at Tricycle Magazine, which is a Buddhist magazine, which, I started reading back when I was in college. And I guess he was probably the editor there when I was reading it in college. And he's had, he lives in Woodstock, New York. He has had an amazing life as a Buddhist monk, and I believe also in the Christian tradition as well. And we're going to talk about darkness because Clark Strand, well, he's sort of a dark guy in a way that you may not usually think of that phrase. We live in a world, as you mentioned, this was in the 60s, and, there was less lighting, like literal just light bulbs in the 60s than there are now. And, you go back, 80 years before that, and there were no light bulbs anywhere. And it's interesting to, one of the things you bring out in your book so well is that we live in an era where we're going through we always talk about the technological changes of the internet, of automobiles, of airplanes and all that. But you're like, no, but also the light bulb, man. Like Thomas Edison, who was famous for hating sleep, like he was like a constant, he said he apparently could survive on like 4 hours of sleep, and maybe genetically he was fine with that. Wrote in his autobiography that people who sleep too much are just lazy, and people who don't aren't able to keep the lights on are just intellectually inferior and unproductive. And he ushered in this enormous change into the world. And usually when we think about technological change, we start off with a little fear about it. We're like, oh no, this is going to be really bad for us. And people said that about the light bulb, and then we just get over it.
What can you say? Some of the smartest, most successful people have the worst character. So Edison's invention was really, I think I described it in Waking Up to the Dark as the light bulb was like the conquistador, that was empowered by modern civilization to vanquish the darkness, right? Which it did. Vanquish or reform the darkness, by bringing it to heal. Throughout my life, from the 1950s through, I want to say like maybe the early 1990s, I guess I really just assumed that maybe I was made a little differently than other people, and certainly. There were no other monks, for instance, when I was a Zen Buddhist monk in the late 1980s at the monastery, who were up in the middle of the night and roaming around the lake and in the graveyard. Mm-hmm. So even there, where you had people who are of a spiritual bent and who are living basically off the grid. I mean, at nighttime, the only illumination in the monastery were candles.
Was this in Japan? Am I right that you were?
This was in America in the in the Catskill Mountains, in a very remote area of the Catskill Mountains. Yeah.
And so you would wander around the graveyard in your Zen Buddhist
No,
monastery, and so you're not a vampire. Just I want to have that on the record.
no, I'm not. And the monastery itself is very remote. I mean, I think the nearest light bulb is probably 4 or 5 miles away. So this is a very dark sort of place. But even there, I felt kind of eccentric. But then I want to say right around 1992 or 1993, I read an article in the New York Times that referenced a sleep study at the National Institutes of Health by a man named Thomas Ware. Now, this was the guy who
I thought it was Robert Ware. Isn't it Robert Ware?
I think there is a Robert Ware, but this particular psychobiologist is named Thomas Ware.
Okay.
And he was a psychobiologist, and he was the guy who basically discovered seasonal affective disorder. He did a lot of research into circadian rhythms, and he had a question. And his question was, did pre-modern human beings and even prehistoric human beings, like going back to the Upper Paleolithic, did they sleep more? Did they sleep better? Did they sleep differently? And he surmised, or I guess hypothesized, and correctly it turns out, that given the relatively slow rate of change in the human genome, more likely than not, human beings were still encoded for whatever pattern of sleep they had in the Upper Paleolithic. Probably that hadn't changed, but the only way to know for sure would be to take human beings off of light-assisted wakefulness. And so what Ware did is he took his subjects in Bethesda, Maryland, off all forms of artificial illumination for a month. And it's a very famous study. For the first 3 weeks, basically all that happened was his subjects were repaying what Ware called the national sleep debt, right? Because Americans are chronically sleep deprived. And so, they would sleep for maybe an hour or two longer every night. But at week 3, a change happened in every subject. Now, if you know anything at all about scientific studies, you know that to get 100% results in anything is pretty extraordinary.
It's normally suspicious, even.
Yeah, you would say that it must be the result of experimental bias or something like that. But to get a result like this was stunning.
Right.
So what happened was everybody in the study began to, they would lie in bed for a couple of hours, after the sun went down, and then they would promptly fall asleep. They would sleep for 4 hours, wake for 2 hours, and then sleep for 4 hours more. And this happened with every subject in the study, like clockwork.
And they also often took naps in the afternoon, right? Like the sleep schedule actually changed dramatically overall.
Right. Overall. Yeah. They were there. It was basically a recalibration, I think, of human psychobiology, right? That was taking place because really light is sort of the master switch for all hormone production. And so if you reset that, going back to formula, as it were, and just, rising with the sun and turning in shortly after dusk, then a lot of changes happen. So yes, I'm sure that's true. What happened was, Ware was, of course, obviously very curious about this. He wanted to know what was happening. So, he hooked them up to monitors. He discovered that his subjects were neither completely awake nor completely asleep, but seemed to be occupying a state of mind that had its own endocrinology.
Yeah.
And was basically a thing unto itself.
And this was this was my, the thing in your book, which fascinated me absolutely the most, right? We have these alert stages that we live in throughout the day. It's the lit, active, focused, what we're doing right now. The people listening to this podcast are probably focused and doing something right now. Yeah. And then we think of sleep pejoratively as unconsciousness, as an inactive state, which is actually not true because dreams are actually quite active, but we can get into that later. But it's what you call in the book, I believe, the hour of the wolf. And I think you also call it the hour of God. And there's a couple other names for this. But this is an intermediate state of consciousness that we inhabit and that we usually don't like, right? In the modern world. In the
Yeah.
modern world, we sit there, we're like, oh, I'm thinking about my taxes and like, what did that girl say to me? Am
Right,
I fat?
right,
Like whatever it
right.
is. But you're
Yeah.
saying something different. You're saying the hour of the wolf is something productive, is something
Yeah.
maybe vital.
Well, the Hour of the Wolf was a term that I took from Ingmar Bergman's psychological
Mm.
thriller, right? But it's a term that's been used in the modern age to refer to the hour or two late in the night, before dawn, but basically the hour between dark and dawn, when human beings feel at their most vulnerable, modern human beings, that is,
Mm-hmm.
right? When special forces are taught to attack because human beings are at their most vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
It's a time when nightmares are more likely to seem real. It's a
Mm-hmm.
time when people believe most babies to be born. It's not actually true, and most people die. The statistics is, a belief that is also not supported by statistics.
Well, it's hard to know
But
now since most ladies get C-sections, so it's a whole different thing.
well, but it is true. I think that most babies were being made
Mm-hmm.
during that hour in pre-modern times because
Sure.
people would all wake up for this gap hour in the middle of the night. So Ware became fascinated with this. He tried to figure out what was going on. He interviewed his subjects, and they said that they had never felt so much peace in their lives. Right? This
Mm-hmm.
was not. They did not experience it as the hour of the wolf. They
Mm.
experienced what I later came to think of as the hour of God,
Yeah.
because they were in this incredibly peaceful state of mind.
Mm-hmm.
So Ware looked into the endocrinology of this, and he discovered that what was happening was that the hormone prolactin, which is
Yes.
the hormone that lets
Mm-hmm.
down in nursing mothers. It's the, it's the, or I'm sorry, it's the hormone that elevates in nursing mothers when their milk lets down
Mm-hmm.
and when they are nursing. It's the same hormone that keeps birds peaceful when they are roosting on their eggs,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's the hormone that keeps our body still and restful while we're asleep.
Yeah.
So
Well,
normally, what happens is if you wake in the middle of the night in modern society, right, where our nights are bookended very tightly on either end by artificial illumination and by modern styles of living that involve 8-hour work weeks and 8-hour sleep nights, right?
mm-hmm.
When you wake up in the middle of the night, you don't feel that peace because your prolactin levels automatically drop.
Right.
What Weir discovered was that if you gave even modern human beings the full spectrum of darkness to work with, what would happen would be that they would fall asleep for 4 hours, wake for 2 hours,
Mm-hmm.
during which their prolactin levels
Mm-hmm.
remained at sleep level.
Oh, wow.
So that meant basically that people felt a profound peace in their bodies, like a kind of a bliss almost.
It's interesting
And even though their minds were technically awake.
in the world that we live in today, right? If you look at sort of the top neuroscientists and the bro scientists and the athletic whatevers, like we talk about dopamine, we talk about testosterone, we talk about these action oriented chemicals and how to optimize them to make you
Right.
like the fit Superman that we all want to be, or guess. And what I loved about your book and the fact that you're like, wait a minute, we have these other hormones that also are vital and they are totally out of whack because we are out of whack with nature. And prolactin is, it's like, it's the nurture, it's the recovery, it's the oxytocin, it's the
Yeah.
introspection hormone. And
They
sometimes,
call it the attachment hormone, actually,
mm,
because it's been linked to the experience of bonding between
mhm,
not only between mothers and infants, but between fathers too. Because fathers who watch a woman nursing a baby will also experience elevated levels of prolactin. Right, it keeps
mhm.
everybody calm and still.
Yeah. And it's funny, we have this lens in the world, and I'm guessing that this is, when you talk about prolactin, it's a good scientific explanation for things. Like, it's a
Right,
language that we in the West like.
right,
Oh, there's prolactin problems, and but the reality is, I think as I read your book, and I'm going to put words in your mouth, perhaps. But like the thing is that we are sort of in an evolutionary mismatch because of our modern world in a number of ways, right? We
Yeah.
don't experience seasons really. We live in an eternal summer where
Right.
usually depending on the hemisphere you're on, you have these huge dips. There's an equinox was important, right? The solstice was
Right.
important,
Right.
and now it's like sort of a news blip. Oh, look, the solstice is coming, huh? Funny. and
Yeah. Right.
and as we get into darkness, like these mental states, which I have found, interesting, reading your book was a way that I started thinking about, when I lie awake at night and my mind goes ruminating, um, I started to sort of think about actually that time in a different way. I like, look, these ruminations is actually can be productive. And one of the reasons why we have so much anxiety about that moment is because we've been forced into this work schedule that
Right.
fixes
Right.
us into an 8-hour productive Edisonian lifestyle. And
Right.
that if we and we also hate naps. Like the book I'm writing is about napping, right? And we're like, oh, napping
Yeah.
is lazy. But the
Yeah.
thing is like you
Right.
discard all of that and get your body back into a place where it can be caring, it can be regenerative, it can be more natural. So in the book you had here's the question, right? In the book you said, um, you basically sort of like tried to put darkness back into your life, but you also said you don't expect your readers to be essentially, to actually get rid of turn off their lights at sundown. So how do we
Right.
integrate this into our lives?
Right. So there are a couple of answers to that question. It's not that I didn't expect people to actually do that, right? To basically respond to what I call the dark manifesto, right? And to actually trigger a kind of a revolution, modern revolution in human consciousness, or rather a reversion to an older style of human consciousness that in light of civilization would be taken as a revolution. It wasn't so much that I didn't expect them to do that. I just thought that, modern human beings are so addicted to light, probably they wouldn't be able to do so on their own.
Mm-hmm.
I do believe that going forward, conditions are not going to be exactly favorable for a hyperlit world, say 100 years or so from now. We're not looking at any kind of a scenario that would result in whatever the techno narcissist will try to tell you. We're not looking at any scenario that's going to result in more energy and more illumination, right?
Yeah,
Or
that's what's
more
coming down the
population.
pipeline for sure.
No, no. The agricultural, the drastic fall in agricultural production over the next 100 years due to climatological factors, species extinction, and a host of other factors.
Mm,
Also, the fact that we're not going to be able to continue to use fossil fuels, and petroleum fertilizer is what allows us to have so many people on the planet currently as it
correct.
is.
Mm-hmm.
But none of those things are going to allow agricultural production to remain at anything like its current levels. So we're going to be looking at far fewer people and
Oh,
probably a somewhat
we're
darker world.
we're going to the doomsday scenario here, Clark.
Well, no, it's not exactly doomsday. It's interesting because people conflate civilization with culture.
Mm-hmm.
And because people can't imagine living any other way than the way we live now,
Mm-hmm.
they assume that the end of civilization means the end of human beings. They say, well,
Mm-hmm.
that's it. It's all over.
Yeah.
But that's it's a very, very anthropocentric way of thinking. And it's also a paleo, what I call a paleo illiterate way of thinking. Because in fact, human beings have existed on this planet for hundreds of thousands of years. We have survived asteroid strikes. We have survived super eruptions. We've survived wild climatological gyrations, ice ages,
Mm.
right? Long droughts. There were 500, I'm sorry, around 5,000 breeding pairs of human beings 72,000 years ago who basically survived the Mount Toba super eruption.
Mm-hmm.
Those people adapted and learned how to hunt with specialized spearheads and harpoon heads made of bone
Hmm.
that hadn't existed before then, right? They
Yeah.
evolved that particular tool making culture. But culture, music, art, dance, good food, storytelling, these things have existed a long, long time before we had civilization.
Right. Before we had any recordings of,
Right,
I think that one of the things you talk about in your book, you think about the word illumination.
right,
We have illuminated a certain amount of our history through writing, through geological art,
right,
artifacts that have shown up with the
right,
archaeological record. But it,
yeah,
it 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 existed way before that. Like, we have not
right,
illuminated much about human
yeah.
history from
Yeah.
5,000 years ago, roughly, 10,000 years
Yeah,
ago,
most of us are
nothing.
paleo illiterate, and
Mhm.
the radical, example of paleo illiteracy, of course, is the fundamentalist Christian, Jew, or Muslim
Mhm.
who retreats into the idea that the world's only a few thousand years old, right?
Right, right.
To deny all of deep time, but in fact, we've existed for a long time, and we can have a deep future as well.
Yeah,
But I do think that that involves going forth to meet the darkness rather than to, waiting for it to arrive.
yeah,
If we're waiting for the hour of the wolf to come for us, that's a pretty dark, grim,
sure.
Cormac McCarthy, the road kind of scenario, right?
Yeah,
But to go forth to meet the darkness is different.
yeah.
That's
Let
not a
let me read a
anxiety
passage of
thing.
I'd like to read a passage from your
Yeah,
book that spoke to me, and then, let's talk about it. There's actually a few that I'd like to go into here. But on page 47, for those readers who have the book with them and are examining, you say
yeah,
darkness is the one remaining revolutionary act. Changing the political order does not matter. Economies are all more or less alike. Governments and cultures rise and fall. The person who chooses to turn off the lights and lie awake in darkness embraces the truth of life beyond all of these. The only way back to the path we once traveled on as a species is through the darkness of deep time. That's
yeah.
heavy, man. That's
That's
heavy
the
stuff.
darkness I'm talking about. And going forth to meet that darkness is going forth to meet deep time.
Hmm.
Now, what I discovered, even really while I was writing the book, even before it was published, was that a lot of people craved the darkness. They
Hmm.
craved they craved the experiences that I was writing about in the book, but then it didn't feel like they had any access to it.
Hmm.
For instance, just to take one gender specific example, I get up and walk in the middle of the night. Most women don't feel like they can do that.
Right. Hmm.
Even women, friends of mine or people women who wrote me after the book was published, even who live in relatively depopulated rural areas,
Hmm.
feel like they're taking their lives in their hands, going for a walk alone at night, and they may very well be right.
Sure. Or
And
they're
so they can't.
considered immoral for doing it. You have streetwalkers, right? Who
Well,
the
I
women.
don't know. I mean, in some repressive cultures, maybe. So don't think in America, that would present an issue. But yeah, but it's just not safe for some people.
Mhm.
Other people, because of their work schedule or the fact that they have, teenagers who are staying up late at night or whatever, they can't, just turn off the lights at dusk and,
Mhm.
live off the grid like that. So what I began to think of was the various different ways of approaching the dark. There is the absolute dark, right, which is to
Mhm.
go without electricity after dusk.
Right.
And then there is the cultivated darkness. And this is where I think, my book overlaps with yours
Mhm.
because we're basically talking about napping and napping related states.
Mhm.
We're talking about, everything from, going to a therapist and lying on a couch and entering into a sort of a free association
Right.
state,
Mhm.
right? Or yoga, anything deep relaxation. For some people, it's knitting,
Mhm.
it's mindfulness, it's meditation. There are a lot of different modalities of what I call the cultivated dark.
Mhm.
Basically, anything that unplugs you or disengages you from the hyper lit culture that insists that there is, insists on utility and efficiency before all else,
Mhm.
productivity, products, consumption,
Mhm.
right? Anything that sort of pulls us momentarily out of off of that treadmill, as it were,
Right.
right? Allows us to relax and begin to find ways to reset our
Mhm.
consciousness.
Yeah,
And if we can do that in the relative absence of artificial light, all the
mhm.
better.
Yeah,
And so people will find, I think that if they do this, they will find themselves maybe turning off the lights a little earlier every night
right.
and, becoming comfortable with the idea of
Mhm.
just being in a dark or dimly lit space.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's really about this continuum of consciousness, right? It's not really about the light. It is about the experience of being alive and conscious. And
Right.
we do think very binary. You're awake, you're asleep, and it's light and dark. These are things that are related, but it's really it's a series of overlapping things. Like you said, you have naturally walked out in the darkness just habitually for your whole life. But most
Yeah.
people will, in the modern world, will, if they go on a walk in the darkness, they'll want a street light or a flashlight or a headlight or
Right.
something
Right.
that
Right.
that pushes it, like pushes that encompassing thing away from them, the
Yeah.
envelopment
Right.
of darkness. And
Yeah.
yet, if we, you know, if you just go out for a walk at night and don't bring that stuff, you actually find that you can navigate the world pretty well, not
Oh, yeah.
perfectly, pretty
There are
well.
all kinds of little tricks you discover that our
Mhm,
ancestors knew. Like, for instance, if you go outside to walk in the dark, there's, most places that people live today, there's, ambient light at night of some form or another, if only the starlight.
mhm,
And if you're walking, for instance, on a road, and you lower your eyes to about a 90-degree level so that you're
mhm,
looking at an area about 10 or 12 feet before you,
mhm.
you'll find that because of the structure of the human eye, that it feels like there's a light glowing
Right.
at the horizon, between
Mhm,
you and the horizon, and that
mhm,
you can actually see things between, out of your sort of upper peripheral vision.
mhm.
You can see things, the shapes, and so you can actually walk without a flashlight at night. Unless you're in a very densely wooded area, where there really isn't any.
Right.
There's leaf cover and you can't see the ground.
Yeah. But
Even then, there are other senses you can use.
right, and you can actually, I've found that in most cases, I can see farther without a flashlight than with a flashlight, and I
Oh,
mean
oh.
see broadly because it's actually you see with all of your senses. You see with
Mm.
your sight and your smell and your
Yeah, let's stop there for a moment because that's really
Mhm,
interesting what you just said. I mean, that's so true, and it's true more just in the literal way, right?
mhm,
But because the way artificial illumination works, it illuminates a certain area and a certain thing,
mhm.
but it has the strange effect of making anything outside of that pool of light
Dark.
look darker,
Mhm,
right?
mhm,
Right? But this is also metaphorically true as well. There was a man named John Staudenmeier, who is a Jesuit historian of technology.
mhm,
And he gave the Boardman lecture, I want to say probably 20, 25 years ago now. I can't remember exactly when, but it was an annual lecture series on technology. And he gave one about artificial illumination. And, it was a very, very interesting talk, really seminal to my way of thinking, because Staudenmeier was one of the first people to really deeply connect
mhm.
the loss of darkness in the modern world to the loss of touch with the spiritual or numinous dimension and
Right.
the human spirit. But Staudenmeier said that the inherent bias of artificial illumination is the belief that everything can be made clear.
Yes.
This was his
Mhm,
core idea.
mhm,
It is the inherent bias that everything can be made clear. Everything can be understood.
mhm.
Everything can be made an object of the human mind.
Right.
Everything can be quantified. Everything can be described perfectly. It's
Mhm.
just a matter of time before we understand everything in the universe.
Right.
That is the inherent bias
Mhm,
of artificial illumination.
mhm.
Ancient peoples, even through the Middle Ages, people did not have this bias because so much of their visual experience of the world was that, beyond their visual field, they couldn't see very far and couldn't see
Mhm,
very clearly. And
mhm.
in the absence of very close artificial illumination and torches and candles didn't provide a great deal,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
Or mirrors focus from the sunlight into indoors, various methods they had of providing light. Even these really only illuminated a small portion
Right.
of what they would have called reality, and they knew how limited it was.
Right. And also with this is the idea that the knowledge of not being able to know things is a knowledge
Yeah,
in itself. It's because you know that you have your candle illuminated in a small little area, and you
right,
don't know what's out there. But it is the reckoning with the unknown, which is a skill that we have lost. I mean,
right.
many of us
That's
have
right.
lost.
That's right.
I wanted to read
And you know,
another. I wanted to read another passage from your book because I think it. I mean, it's deep. Again, it's dark because everything's dark in this discussion. And I want to read it, and then let's just talk about what this means.
hmm,
This is, for those of you following, it's page 52. The dead are in the dark in numbers too vast for our ordinary consciousness to comprehend. Who are they? They are more than our lineage of direct biological ancestors, as numberless as those ancestors are, and they aren't just human. Every plant, animal, and insect alive on the planet today is linked to ancestral mothers and fathers without end. And every cell has ancestors too. Even the mountains and valleys and deserts, the streams and the oceans have ancestors. Everything that exists now exists because of what has come before. But before doesn't mean gone. And then you go on from there, and
yeah,
it's stark, and it's awesome, and it's weighty, right? It's we live in a world where the past is in darkness and it is dead, and that dead is also our life.
yeah. Yeah, I mean that's in a part of the book where I talk a lot about deep time,
Mm-hmm.
and also about the dead. Waking Up to the Dark is part of a trilogy of books. The first book is Waking Up to the Dark. The second is called The Way of the Rose, which was written by me and my wife, Perdita
Mm-hmm.
Fenn. And the third book, which is coming out, I guess, in 2 months,
Mm-hmm.
in early September, is Take Back the Magic. And that's
Mm-hmm.
written by Perdita alone.
Mm-hmm.
And the themes of the three books, if we were to sum them up in one word each, the first book is about the dark, waking up to the dark. The Way of the Rose is about the dirt, because
Mm-hmm.
it is going back and looking at taking one ancestral spiritual practice, the Catholic Rosary,
Mm-hmm.
and tracing it to its Paleolithic origins and
Mm.
its origins in the mystery religions of the ancient world.
Right.
And the final book, Take Back the Magic, is about the dead.
Mm.
And so all three books, treat all three themes in them, but each one has a special emphasis.
Yeah.
But yeah, the I think that we have in the modern world we've lost touch with deep time. We've lost touch with the
Could we define
long
what deep
story.
time is?
Yeah, deep time is ancestral time, basically. It is time so deep that all of human history could vanish in it and leave scarcely a ripple. We humans, depending on who you talk to, humans have been more or less human for, 70,000 years, 120,000 years, 300,000 years. But, these dividing lines are largely kind of arbitrary. So if you
Totally.
start looking
Mm-hmm.
at hominids,
Mm-hmm.
then we go back even millions of years. And so to divorce ourselves willingly from that past is again use that term that I coined is to become paleo illiterate, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is to live only in this brief bubble that we
Mm-hmm.
call civilization,
Mm-hmm.
which is basically built in defiance of
Yeah.
a planetary ecosystem, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we built this thing atop by using extractive processes of mining and forced agriculture. We have built this civilization, based on resources that are non-renewable. And
Right.
so it's just a matter of time before those play out, and we enter a kind of an end game uh, uh, in-game scenario. There are a lot of ways that could have happened. For us, it's happened mostly with fossil fuels and modern pollutants.
So you are not what we would call a techno-futurist. You are not somebody who believes
Oh,
that technology is going to come in and save the day with a new whiz-bang solution.
no, I'm one of the few people who thought that Stephen Hawking was an amazingly brilliant person and somewhat of an idiot as a human being, right? Because he and a lot of his fellows were constantly talking about how, well, we're going to need to leave Earth, right, and go someplace else. And I felt like, I would read these various articles and interviews with him about the need basically to escape this planet because we're basically doomed if we want to try to live here. We should migrate to the stars or whatever. And I always thought, did no one ever teach you any basic biology, or were you just born an astrophysicist from age 5 and never studied anything else? Because there is no way everything about the human body, right, is tooled to life on this planet.
Yes.
We are one with life on this planet, and we can't exist outside of this biosphere. We and the Earth are one.
It's the idea
And the idea that if you're going to migrate to some other planet, you're going to have to take Earth with you in order to survive.
Right. We have this idea that humans are exceptional in a way, and that we are not connected to the world and our environment, and we don't realize that we are the environment. We are that we've come up from here. We are connected from here, and like our little blue dot. Maybe you could make Mars sort of Earth-like. Maybe, I mean, you could have a technological explanation for how to do it, but it's not going to be better than Earth, right? It's gonna pale in comparison to Earth.
It's a little bit, like when you grow up and you leave your parents' home, it's only when you really realize what it was like, to have parents and to live at home. I mean, provided you have good nurturing parents, not everybody does, but if you have good nurturing parents, a lot of the work that they do for you to make your life livable and keep you alive and healthy and happy is sort of invisible. Well, the planet's a lot like that, right? You can think in very, sort of simplistic, not simplistic, but we can think in terms of the ancient, mystery cults, where they talked about the sun as the father and the earth as the mother, and the interplay of these two forces. It turns out to be quite accurate from an ecological, environmental point of view. The only thing that really comes to the earth from beyond the earth to sustain and cause life and to regulate its patterns and cycles is the sun. Everything else is just here, right? And so, I think human beings who tried to leave this planet would very quickly discover that they never knew what went into actually making human life possible. They would quickly learn that that they were the recipients of gifts and blessings from every possible side, going back billions of years.
Right.
And that's not possible to reproduce with technology.
Well, or if it is possible, I mean, I've read enough science fiction books that and they all sort of point out that maybe this stuff is possible in various ways, but it's going to be very different, and in a way that you may not even conceive of as even human. Right.
I don't think it's going to happen in the next 100 years.
No. In the next 100 years, we have a very.
I'm not putting my money there.
One other thing that I liked, and I'm not going to read this section, but it's, you point out that in the Christian tradition, we talk about Satan as the prince of darkness, but he also has the other name, right? The other name is Lucifer, which is the bringer of light.
Right.
And one, that's a great contradiction. The Christians covered all their bases. But on the other hand, the bringing of the light is Prometheus also brought fire, right? And that was a good thing, but he was also this fallen person because of that. And we live in this contradiction where we see progress, and progress, there are benefits. I'm glad that I live in this day and age. Like, I think it's pretty awesome to live in this day and age. Right. But it comes at a cost, and where the future goes, you had mentioned earlier that you see the future is a future of returning to darkness, and we are like a brief, essentially a match that has been lit, and
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
burning now. But where
Yeah.
does it look? Where do you think, where do you think that we're going to be in, say, 100 or 500 years?
Well, I don't, no one really knows. I don't know about 500 years. It's hard for me to really think it through, quite that far. I personally don't have much hope for the survival of large scale human institutions.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the conditions that have favored the building of civilizations and empires are reaching their natural conclusion.
Mm.
I do not believe that it's going to be possible to maintain anything like the sort of global networks and global power structures that exist today. And in fact, I'm not even sure that we're going to have anything 100 years from now resembling what we would call a country today, even.
Hmm.
I don't think that human beings are going to be able to survive to the degree to which they try to preserve those institutions. I think those institutions are what's killing us.
Hmm.
And I think that those institutions, to the degree to which we try to maintain them, will cause us to do greater harm to the environment and greater harm to ourselves. I
Interesting.
think at a certain point, there's a
Mm.
tipping point that comes where people look around
Mm.
and they realize that the people they need to rely on to survive are the people they can see with their eyes and
Interesting.
hear with their ears and come into physical contact with their hands, their bodies.
Mm.
The people that they need to survive are going to be the people in their local area that they have to collaborate with in order to
Mm-hmm.
live. Now, I don't. It's not so much that I don't think we can go back to, like quote a hunter gatherer lifestyle. I don't know what's possible. Do species
Yeah.
sometimes revert? Apparently, and throughout evolutionary history, there have been species that went back to previous ways of living. There have even been human beings who chose civilization and then
Absolutely.
chose to
Yeah.
forego
Mm-hmm.
civilization. Right?
Yeah.
David
There's a
Bowie.
really good book, and I want to think it's now I can't remember the name, but the brief history of everything, basically.
Right.
And
Exactly. Yeah.
and
So this has happened,
so
but
so there's two different ways to think about what this future might look like, and both are
right.
very hard, right?
Right.
One, the scenario you laid out, it's the dissolution of institutions to
Right. Right.
becoming, because we can only really interact with our small groups and rely on our small
Right.
groups. And but there's
Right.
another way to conceive of it that is also has a little more hope for large scale human civilization, which is that
Right.
we see ourselves as part of a greater whole, right? We see
Right.
ourselves as, in a sense, cells in a super organism, and we actually try to participate because our own individuality is not the focal point. And we would
Yeah.
need to evolve to some degree as a species and have a very different mindset in order to preserve civilization by actually
Yeah.
participating with the planet. And I think both, if you don't do that, I think we end up exactly with what you're saying: very small,
Yeah.
isolated
Right.
tribalism,
Right.
or we end
Yeah.
up in a way that somehow our consciousness got a little bit more resilient, like ants in a
Right.
colony. Right? It's not the ant
Right.
that matters; it's
Right.
the colony that matters.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, uh, yeah, I think personally, I don't see human beings, en masse,
Mm-hmm.
experiencing, what would amount to essentially a mass conversion of the whole species, like
Mm-hmm.
within a fairly limited period of time we have to do such a thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't personally sort of see that happening. Doesn't seem to be any precedent for it, as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
I mean, it is true that human beings seem to have learned how to do agriculture all over the world pretty much at once
Yeah.
within a fairly short period of
Mm-hmm.
time. So I do think that people can find new ways to live, but I think that those will probably be dictated by necessity rather than through any kind of inner transformation. I
Sure.
think it's very easy. We live in in a world that has been where our minds have basically been sort of subtly restructured and
Yes.
recoded
Mm-hmm.
by, for lack of a better word, I will call religious or theological ways of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
This goes back maybe as long as 4 or 5,000 years. People began to think theologically or religiously. But this isn't what it seems like. Like theology means like the study of God, right?
Right.
But it's always really not been about that.
Mm-hmm.
Religious ways of thinking have always been about anthropocentrism.
Mm-hmm.
They have all been about
The storytelling ape, right?
redefining human life, putting human life at the top of everything.
Mm-hmm.
Like even Buddhism is, sees human life as the most precious life, the only
Right.
life where you could
Right.
become a Buddha, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, all religions are radically anthropocentric,
Yes.
with the exception of a few, religious traditions or
A few
uh,
indigenous traditions have
yeah, a
sort of a
few
more
indigenous
animistic.
traditions
Mm-hmm.
still exist that are more animistic, but the organized religions are all profoundly anthropocentric,
Yeah.
and so that way of thinking is going to play itself out.
Mm-hmm.
If you think of the Bible is a good example. I spent a number of years reading the Bible very, very
Oh, I
closely
lost.
with a group of people here. Do you lose me?
You broke up for a second, but don't worry about it.
Oh, okay. I spent, I think, almost 14 years reading the Bible with a group of people every Thursday night here in Woodstock. It was kind of a think tank.
Mm-hmm.
It was called the Koans of the Bible, and we basically read the
The
scriptures
koans
like
of the Bible. I love it.
Zen koans. Yeah, we read them. We didn't read them in a religious way.
Mm-hmm.
And we said we only had two rules. You got to question anything, but you didn't get to throw anything out. Like just because you didn't like something, you didn't get to pretend it wasn't there. You had to look at it. And so we had all different kinds of people come to this. We had feminists, we had witches, we had people with a strong ecological bent. We
Mm-hmm.
had practicing Jews and Christians and Catholics, and all kinds of people came to this group. And what we came to ultimately was an understanding that the Bible was like the world's longest literary thought experiment.
Huh.
And it starts with the idea of human beings being given complete control over the ecosystem,
Mm-hmm.
right? Having dominion over the fish of the sea and the fowls of the air and the beasts of the field and so forth and so on,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
And being at the top of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Being at the apex.
Right.
Every religion has its own version of this. Even Buddhism has its own version of this, human supremacy.
Right.
Religions are based on the idea of human supremacy.
In
The
Buddhism,
Bible,
even the gods, if you look at Mahayana
yeah,
Buddhism, even the gods are below the humans.
right, exactly. So that, well, no, the gods are a little bit above the human beings, but it's a circle in Buddhism. So
Right. But you
what
can't,
goes around comes around.
but the god doesn't have the opportunity to become enlightened in the same way the human does.
Right, that's right. So in that sense, yeah, in that sense, you're right. The human is where enlightenment is a possibility. So they're profoundly anthropocentric. So I'm trying to think, what was my train of thought? I lost it. What were we
Oh
doing?
man.
uh, that's what happens. That's what happens when you get older.
Well,
I'll think of it in a second.
well,
Oh yeah, the Bible is a thought. So the Bible is a thought experiment. So
mm,
the Bible asks the question, and again, if you're a true believer, or you live in a biblical culture, or even if you live in a culture where you've rejected the Bible, you're still stuck inside this book, right?
right.
Western culture has been stuck inside of these texts, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Quran and
Mm-hmm.
the Christian Bible and the Tanakh, right?
Mm-hmm.
For millennia.
Mm-hmm.
You can't see the plain obvious truth, which is that it is a thought experiment that says what happens if human beings are in control. And the answer is it begins in Genesis, and where does it end? It ends in Revelation
Mm-hmm.
with the destruction of the earth.
Mm-hmm.
The end of Revelation, a new world descends basically out of the heavens because this world has been destroyed by
Mm-hmm.
human beings. So
Mm-hmm.
what it says is that, yeah, this is what happens. What's
Mm-hmm.
going to happen is human beings are going to destroy their own world
Yeah.
by
Well, it's
declaring they have dominion over it.
in that sense, it's the same conversation that we're having. I mean, I am of the opinion that all of these holy books that we've had, there's wisdom in them, but they're also human constructions. Like, I mean, we can look at the
Right.
historicity of all of these books, even the Buddha's own teachings. There's a history to that, and they
Yeah.
become palimpsests for our own. Uh, Fears and projections of what the world will look like, and no one has actually predicted what the world will look like. Like, no one knows what's coming
Right.
around the corner. It could be a lot of
No.
different things, but we are
Yeah.
aware that endings are
Yeah.
possible, right? We're all
Right.
aware that that could be
Yeah.
um,
But
emerging.
we're living in the middle of a mass extinction right now,
Right.
and at the very least, that may cause more serious problems for us ultimately before climate
Yeah.
change does,
Yeah.
because that radical loss of biodiversity, we don't really understand what it means. For instance, to have lost
Yeah.
30% of the birds in North
Yeah.
America in
Or
a
the
50-year period.
insects, but it's interesting when we
Right.
when we talk, even when we make a statement like that, and I'm prone to those statements as well. When we think about that, it's still a really interestingly anthrocentric way of looking at it, because if we actually think about deep time, right, if we act,
Yep.
the earth is going to be fine. Like, life is
Yeah.
going to be fine. Like, we would have to fuck things up in a way that is much bigger than we could. Like, we'd have to get hit by the asteroid and the earth blows
Yeah.
up for life to not
Right.
exist. But instead,
Right.
what we're mourning is the end of the Anthropocene. It's the
Well, the end of human supremacy, I think,
Mhm.
is the end of this notion that human beings are in charge and human beings can control everything, and coming back to light that everything can be known,
Right.
and that what can be known can be controlled
Hmm.
ultimately.
Hmm.
Uh, so yeah, I think I do think that human beings can learn to live in a way going forward that, like I said, I think given the state of the earth today, we can't live as human as hunter gatherers. Even if our population were drastically reduced, you know it wouldn't be reduced to the level in the amount of time that we're looking at where it would have to happen. It wouldn't be reduced to the scale where we could even live as hunter gatherers in the Upper Paleolithic, right? I mean, the Upper Paleolithic, there were not a lot of human beings living on the land compared to how many there are now. So we're going to have to find other ways,
Yeah.
like small scale horticulture, community gardening, community farming.
Hmm.
We're going to have to find other ways
And
to collaborate.
I promise you, dear listeners, that you are not going to be able to figure it out. Like, it's something that's going to happen to us, not something that
That's
we think it through. Like, don't start your community garden thinking that's going to get you through the apocalypse.
I think human beings have forgot. We think we're in charge,
Uh-huh.
and we're not very good at being in charge. I mean, yes, I suppose we are in charge, but that doesn't really typically end very well for human beings.
Hmm.
All you have to do is read Greek myth to see where that goes, or
Hmm.
the Bible.
You know,
But we are very adaptive, and I think
mhm,
human beings have forgotten that what it means truly to adapt and to adapt to
mhm.
changing circumstances and to adapt in the face of you know near annihilation is something that human beings not only can do but have done many times before.
Mhm. And, should we make it through this whatever limiting event, assuming that a limiting event happens, assuming enough of us make it through, there will be sort of new forms to show up, and there will be new futures. And I don't think that we can conceive of them because they exist in that darkness that you've already spoken to. Because even when we project into the future, we're trying to get our flashlights out and shine it
Yeah.
at something that we can never know. I there's so much more to talk to you about this. I think that we could riff on this for one of those 3-hour explorations. And um, but I think that it would be it's worthwhile for people to actually ingest your work because it's really really interesting and it's very multifaceted, multidimensional, and frankly new. Like it's not, these are not thoughts that that are right now out in the zeitgeist in sort of a real way. So I highly suggest people to check out Waking Up to the Dark. I especially, some people just read like the first like third of a book. They pick up a book and they read a third. Well, I want to tell you people, luckily the book is only a third of a book long. It's only 110 pages, so it's not an enormous investment in time to get through it. And even if you just read the first 30 pages, you're doing it's still amazing. And so Clark Strand, I really appreciate you coming here. And if people want to find out more, where can they locate your stuff?
Well, thanks, Scott. I appreciate it. It's been a wonderful conversation. If people want to contact me, I'm on Instagram and Facebook under Clark Strand, but also they can go to wayoftheRose.org, wayoftheRose.org. And that is the website for the community that my wife Perdita Finn and I founded. And it is an international, non-religious, post-religious rosary fellowship that uses the rosary as a sort of a trellis to grow a spiritual community. That's the traditional, more or less traditional rosary, but we don't treat it in a religious way. But our motto is ecology, not theology. And so the prayers are used for building community. People pray for their heart's desire, which is really kind of the only antidote to a civilization and a capitalist culture that wants to tell you what to desire, what you should desire, what you should do, right? Yeah. So it's a way of sort of recalibrating, our souls in community with one another. So you can reach out and there are a lot of information about waking up to the dark, take back the magic, way of the rose. We have, like, I want to say maybe 10 Zoom meetings a day.
Oh my God. What are you doing?
Members all over the world. Well, we don't run them.
Oh,
I only run two meetings a week. I think I have 2 meetings and Perdita has 2 meetings. The others are run by members all over the world.
Great. I mean,
we have the Rose group on Facebook too that you can join.
I was about to say, it sounds like you just gave yourself a job, which is very against the idea of what we're doing.
It doesn't pay. It's all volunteer.
Thank you so much. And for everyone who's listening, if you want to support what we do here on this podcast and elsewhere, there's of course the Patreon and the things and the reviews and the likes, and do the things that the internet people want, because apparently it's going to save us from civilizational collapse in some way, I guess. Scott Carney Investigates in Denver, Colorado. Thank you so much for being here, and until next week.